Hey guys. Tonight, we're setting sail on a very creaky wooden ship. No, not the romantic kind you picture in glossy paintings with proud sails against a golden horizon. I mean the damp, moldy, rat-infested medieval kind. The one that smells like salt, sweat, tar, and last week's fish guts. So, go ahead, dim your lights, lie back. Pretend you're wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket instead of your nice modern sheets. And imagine the gentle rocking of the sea, though in reality it would have been less gentle rocking and more violent jolting followed by seasickness. But don't worry, you're safe in bed. You're not about to be dumped into the North Sea by a poorly tied rope. Tonight we're talking about how medieval sailors slept during stormy nights. Spoiler, it wasn't comfortable. Now, here's the thing about ships in the Middle Ages. They weren't designed with comfort in mind. Nobody sat down in the year 1300 and said, let's create a cozy maritime Airbnb. These were floating work platforms, designed to move cargo, soldiers, or pilgrims. Sleeping was more of a side quest. Sailors didn't really have bedrooms. They had whatever sliver of deck space they weren't currently being yelled at to scrub, climb, or tie something on. But let's set the scene. Picture a medieval cog, which was basically a floating barrel with a single square sail. Cogs were popular in Northern Europe, especially for trade across the North Sea and the Baltic. They were wide, clumsy, and about as graceful as a log drifting downstream. If you were a sailor on one, your bed was most likely the deck itself. Flat planks of wood, exposed to rain, spray, and the occasional bucket of waste being emptied overboard. Romantic, isn't it? Of course, if the weather was bad, and by bad, I mean the kind of storm that makes you question why humanity ever thought sailing was a good idea. Sleep was nearly impossible. Imagine lying on wet boards while your entire world tilts at a 30-degree angle every few seconds. You finally start to drift off, only to be rolled into a coil of rope, smacked in the face by a swinging pulley, or doused with seawater. Very restful. There's a reason sailors often slept in shifts, or what we'd now call watch rotations. Crews were divided into groups, usually 2 or 3, who alternated between working and resting. If you were lucky enough to be in the off-duty group during a storm, you might try to sleep below deck. But below deck on a medieval ship was not exactly a luxury suite. Picture a dark, cramped space with no ventilation except the holes rats chewed through. The floor was damp, the air smelled like mold and sweat, and if the ship was taking on water, congratulations, you just got an unwanted foot bath. Let's talk about hammocks because you might be picturing them. After all, hammocks in ships seem like peanut butter and jelly. But here's the catch. Hammocks weren't a European thing until the late 15th and early 16th centuries. They came from the Caribbean, adopted from indigenous peoples. So our medieval sailors, no hammocks for them, just the good old floor, and by floor, I don't mean smooth polished planks. I mean uneven boards, splinters, and whatever cargo you happen to be transporting that season. Grain, barrels, livestock. Sometimes sailors had to wedge themselves between crates just to keep from rolling around. It's a bit like trying to sleep in the back of a moving pickup truck filled with chickens, except wetter, colder, and with more rats. Now, because we're talking stormy nights, let's pause and appreciate what that would actually sound like. Picture lying in the dark, trying to drift off. Above you, the timbers are groaning. The sail is flapping violently. Every few seconds, waves crash against the hull with a thunder that makes you wonder if the boards are about to split open. Add in the sound of men yelling because sailors yelled constantly during storms and the occasional clatter of something heavy falling. It's basically a sleep soundtrack from hell. Still, the human body is adaptable. After days or weeks at sea, sailors learned to sleep through almost anything. Their bodies got used to the constant motion. Some could curl up and doze in the corner of the deck even with rain pouring on them. Others learned to nap in short bursts, 15 minutes here, 20 there, whenever they weren't actively being ordered to haul a rope or fix a sail. What about bedding? Did sailors bring pillows and blankets from home? Sometimes a cloak might double as a blanket, a sack of clothing could serve as a pillow, but the idea of each sailor having a personal bedroll was, let's just say, optimistic. Bedding got wet fast, and once it was wet, it stayed wet. Imagine crawling under a blanket that smells like mildew and never dries. That was pretty standard. One of the main problems was rats. Ships were full of them. They got into the food, gnawed on ropes, and scurried over sleeping sailors. If you were lucky, you only woke up to the sound of scratching. If you were unlucky, you discovered that a rat had tried nibbling your toes. Medieval sailors probably accepted this as part of life. After all, sleep wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. Get enough rest to function, and you'd make it to the next port. Let's float for a moment over to medieval galley ships, which were more common in the Mediterranean. These ships had benches for rowers, stacked side by side. If you weren't rowing, you might lie down right on the bench. That meant sleeping inches away from where someone else had been sweating for hours. Cozy, right? And on stormy nights, when rowing was nearly impossible, everyone just huddled together under whatever tarps or sails could be stretched overhead. Now, you might be wondering, how often did sailors actually get a full night's sleep? The answer is almost never. Sailors lived by the bell, or the watch system. A typical watch rotation might mean 4 hours of work, 4 hours of rest, repeated around the clock. That rest time wasn't guaranteed sleep, of course. If the ship hit bad weather, everyone got pulled on deck, no matter what. So a stormy night's sleep was usually just fragments of interrupted naps, snatched between moments of sheer chaos. There's also the fun detail that sailors often slept fully clothed, not just because it was cold, but because you never knew when you'd be ordered to spring into action. Imagine trying to haul on ropes while half asleep in your underclothes. No, thank you. Better to keep your damp wool tunic on and hope you didn't catch hypothermia before morning. And speaking of hypothermia, let's talk about cold. Medieval ships did not have heating. No fireplaces, no cozy braziers. Fire on a wooden ship was a very bad idea. So in northern seas, nights were brutally cold, especially in winter. A sailor's only heat source was body heat, which meant huddling together like penguins. Stormy nights often meant wet clothes, soaked blankets, and icy winds sweeping across the deck. Trying to sleep under those conditions was less drifting off peacefully and more shivering yourself into unconsciousness. If all this sounds miserable, well, it was. But sailors did it anyway, because the alternative was starvation on land, or conscription, or just plain poverty. Life at sea was hard, but it was still a job, and sailors learned to adapt. So, now that we've established that medieval sailors basically slept wherever they collapsed, let's float gently into the great divide between them and the people actually in charge, because of course rank mattered at sea. The officers, captains, or wealthy passengers on board. They weren't rolling around on the bare planks with rats chewing their shoelaces. Oh no, they got cabins. And by cabin, don't imagine a quaint little wooden room with a bed, desk, and oil lamp. A medieval ship's cabin was more like a glorified cupboard tacked onto the stern. Cramped, dark, often shared, but still walls, a door, maybe even a small chest to sit on. Luxury by sailor standards. Captains usually had a great cabin at the very back, sometimes big enough for a small bed or pallet. If you were the master of the ship, you might get a straw mattress, which sounds nice until you remember straw plus salt water equals mold city. Still, you could technically lie down without someone accidentally stepping on your head, and in a storm, you were as sleepless as everyone else, but at least you were sleepless in semi-privacy. Passengers, especially rich ones, brought their own bedding. Think portable mattresses, feather pillows, even curtains. Pilgrims heading to the Holy Land sometimes squeezed into makeshift shelters below deck, surrounded by barrels of wine and salted fish, which honestly sounds more like being trapped in a medieval dormitory where everyone snores, coughs, and prays loudly in the dark. Stormy night sleep here, basically non-existent. But let's drift back to sailors. Because for them, sleep wasn't just uncomfortable, it was strategic. You didn't just lie down and drift off. You had to find the safest possible spot, ideally one where you wouldn't roll overboard in your sleep, because yes, that happened. Ships didn't exactly have railings like modern cruise liners. A stormy night, combined with exhaustion, meant you could icily roll across the slick deck and dupes into the sea. Nobody was diving in after you either. If you went overboard at night, you were gone. Sleep lightly, my friends. And then, there's the watch system again. 4 hours on duty, 4 hours off. But sailors weren't machines. A storm might stretch everyone's work time far beyond that, which meant your precious off-duty sleep time could shrink into nothing. Some records even note that sailors would sleep standing up against the mast, just to snatch a few moments of rest. That's not exactly a power nap. That's your body giving up and shutting down for survival. Now, let's talk about food and drink, because that also affected sleep. Medieval sailors basically lived on salted meat, hardtack, which was like crunchy, moldy drywall, and ale or wine watered down enough not to kill them. If you've ever eaten way too much sodium before bed, you know the restless, thirsty sleep that follows. Imagine that every single night, plus alcohol as your main hydration source. Sleep came fast, but it wasn't good sleep. Between dehydration, seasickness, and the gentle gnawing of rats at your provisions, sleep quality was a joke. There are also some fun medieval complaints recorded about noise. Chroniclers describe the thunderous roaring of the sea and wind, the groaning of the timbers, and the endless shouts of sailors, which basically tells us what we already guessed. The medieval sound machine was not waves gently lapping the shore. It was more like 24/7's construction site during a hurricane. So how did sailors actually manage to sleep in storms? They used a mix of stubbornness and exhaustion. The body can adapt to almost anything, and sailors were living proof. Some curled up in corners, others wedged themselves into ropes or nets to stay put. A few just sprawled out wherever they dropped. Sleep didn't mean comfort, it meant survival fuel. Get enough to keep moving. That's it. Now, if we slide over to Mediterranean galleys again, things get more interesting. The rowers often had assigned benches, which sounds organized until you realize those benches were your bed, your workplace, and your dining table all in one. You rowed there, you ate there, you slept there. You also dealt with everyone else's sweat there, and during storms, when rowing paused, you got to lie on that same bench while rain poured on your head and officers shouted over the noise. Restful, not exactly. But at least you didn't risk rolling across the deck like loose cargo. Speaking of cargo, let's not forget that sailors sometimes literally slept on it. If you had a deck filled with sacks of grain or wool, guess what? Instant lumpy mattress. Not too bad, unless the storm ripped open a barrel of salted fish, in which case you were napping in what amounted to a medieval seafood stew. Again, comfort was a foreign concept. And yes, I can hear you wondering, didn't anyone invent something clever to make sleep easier? Not really. Hammocks, as I said before, came late. Sailors in medieval Europe simply didn't have them. They made do with cloaks, ropes, and barrels. Sometimes they tied themselves down so they wouldn't roll away mid-sleep. Picture a man voluntarily strapping himself to a plank just so he could nap in a thunderstorm. That was life at sea. Here's where we should pause for one of those little ironic contrasts. Wealthy lords and kings on land slept in giant featherbeds with velvet curtains, warmed by fireplaces and attended by servants. Meanwhile, the men keeping their trade goods moving across the seas were curled up in puddles of brine, trying not to drown in their sleep. Medieval class systems. Storm survival routines also played into this. During truly violent storms, almost nobody slept. Everyone was on deck, manning pumps, hauling ropes, or praying loudly. Once the storm passed, though, the ship turned into a mass of unconscious bodies. Sailors would collapse in piles, like shipboard dominoes, asleep in whatever position they landed. Sometimes for hours, sometimes just minutes, until the next shout dragged them up again. And because sailors were human, not machines, this constant exhaustion made tempers flare. Chroniclers note plenty of fights and quarrels during voyages, usually after sleepless storm nights. Imagine being sleep-deprived, seasick, soaked, and trying to choke down moldy bread. You're not exactly in your best mood. No wonder mutinies occasionally sparked after weeks of this. Sleep deprivation makes everyone cranky. There's also the delightful detail that lice and fleas were constant companions, which meant even if you managed to drift off in the middle of a storm, you might wake up scratching yourself raw. Nothing says cozy bedtime like being chewed on by bugs while the ocean tries to kill you. And yet, sailors did this for years. They went on voyage after voyage, somehow sleeping enough to function. Some even got used to the storm rhythm, learning to rock themselves into sleep with the motion of the waves. It's incredible what the human body can tolerate, though I imagine very few sailors ever described their jobs as restful. So, by now you've probably realized that medieval sailors weren't exactly getting their 8 hours, or even their 4 hours, or, really, anything resembling decent rest. And that lack of sleep didn't just make them cranky. It had long-term effects that turned the average sailor into, well, a living example of what happens when you combine malnutrition, exhaustion, and constant damp. First, let's talk about bodies. Chronic lack of sleep makes anyone weak, and on a medieval ship, that weakness showed fast. Sailors were expected to haul heavy ropes, climb masts, and load cargo while running on maybe 90 minutes of broken naps. Add in seasickness, diarrhea from spoiled food, and the fact that everyone was perpetually wet, and you basically had a floating hospital ward without the hospital. Scurvy is the famous sailor disease, of course, but it wasn't the only one. Lack of sleep weakened immune systems, making sailors more vulnerable to fevers, lung infections, and skin sores. Imagine sleeping in wet wool for days. You'd wake up chafed, cold, and probably coughing. A medieval storm wasn't just a bad night. Sleep it could be the start of pneumonia. The fun part. Doctors of the time didn't really link this to sleep deprivation. They blamed the unhealthy sea air, which is an elegant way of saying, we don't actually know, but something smells funny, so let's blame that. Meanwhile, sailors just kept dozing off in corners and wondering why their teeth fell out. Now, let's sprinkle in some anecdotes. Chroniclers occasionally mention sailors sleeping in ridiculous positions after storms. One 14th century account describes men collapsing like that slain upon the battlefield, except these weren't corpses, they were just that tired. Another writer noted that sailors sometimes fell asleep while eating, chewing until they literally passed out mid-bite. Picture a man snoring softly into his bowl of stew while the ship lurches around him, very dignified. And then there's the reputation sailors earned for being surly and foul-mouthed. Well, no wonder. Imagine being hungry, soaked, bug-bitten, and woken up every 20 minutes to haul a rope in the dark. Of course you'd curse like a sailor. Of course you'd drink too much whenever you got to port. The stereotype of the rough, hard-living sailor didn't come from nowhere. It came from decades of cumulative sleepless misery. Interestingly, medieval officers sometimes complained that their crews were lazy or sluggish, which, again, wasn't laziness. It was bone-deep exhaustion. But the captain, who got to sleep in his damp but private cupboard, didn't he always understand why the barefoot guy on deck couldn't leap to attention at the crack of dawn? It's a pattern we see over and over in history. The boss sleeps better than the workers, then wonders why the workers are dragging. Another storm-related issue was injury. Sleep-deprived sailors stumbled more, slipped on wet decks, and sometimes fell from the rigging. Falling asleep mid-task at sea wasn't just embarrassing, it could be fatal. There are scattered records of men literally nodding off while tying ropes and tumbling overboard. So yes, Sleeping in storms wasn't just uncomfortable. It could actively kill you if you weren't careful. Let's also not forget dreams. Imagine finally drifting into sleep after 3 straight days awake in a storm. What do you dream of? Probably not peaceful fields. Sailors' dreams were full of the sea itself, sometimes terrifying visions of drowning, sometimes religious visions of saints or devils. Chroniclers note that many sailors were deeply superstitious, and sleeplessness only fed that. A man woken suddenly in the dark might swear he'd seen spirits on deck, or mermaids or worse. Lack of rest plus constant fear blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Of course, medieval society didn't call this sleep deprivation psychosis, they called it omens. If a sailor swore he saw a ghost on the mast at 2 a.m., the crew might actually believe him. Stormy nights were fertile ground for superstition, and exhausted sailors only made it worse. Now, let's look at how this shaped their personalities on land. When sailors reached port, they were often described as reckless, rowdy, and hard-drinking. But imagine yourself in their shoes. You've spent weeks or months on a ship, getting almost no rest, constantly wet, constantly shouted at. You finally stumble off the gangplank and onto dry land. What do? You collapse in a tavern bed, or you guessed it, to drink until you pass out, sometimes both at once. Medieval towns near ports often complained about sailor behavior, but really, they were just catching up on all the missing sleep, with a bit of liquid encouragement. And if we zoom out for a moment, here's the bigger irony. Sleep deprivation made sailors good at their jobs. They were used to pushing through exhaustion. They could function on almost nothing. They were adaptable, flexible, and stubborn. In other words, the very conditions that destroyed their health also forged them into the kind of people who could keep ships moving across dangerous seas. That doesn't make it noble, it just makes it tragic. So when we imagine a medieval storm at sea, lightning, roaring waves, frantic shouts, it's worth remembering that most of the men on board weren't just terrified, they were also half asleep. Their bodies ached, their eyes burned. And yet, somehow, they pulled ropes, patched sails, and survived. Sleep was never really restful. It was just the bare minimum needed to keep them alive. So, let's do one of my favorite little contrasts. On land, medieval sleep was, believe it or not, a fairly big deal. Wealthy people, especially royals and nobles, practically turned bedtime into a performance. Think giant feather mattresses, velvet drapes, fur blankets, and more cushions than any human body could ever require. Some royal beds were so elaborate they had names. Like warhorses, kings literally gave them titles. The bed was a throne for horizontal royalty. Now take that image: gold-embroidered pillows, scented sheets, and toss it right into the North Sea, because a sailor's bed was a wet plank. And no, I'm not exaggerating. Archaeological studies of medieval ships haven't found anything that looks like crew sleeping quarters, just decks, holds, and cargo space. The assumption is simple. Sailors slept wherever their exhausted bodies gave out. The contrast couldn't be more brutal. One group is tucking in under embroidered quilts, while another is curled up next to a barrel of dried fish, scratching at flea bites. Even among sailors, there were little class differences. Officers might have an actual pallet, maybe a straw mattress in a cramped cabin. Ordinary sailors, they were lucky to find a dry corner. And since dry on a medieval ship is a relative term, even that was debatable. Let's slide into some disasters caused at least in part by bad sleep. Chroniclers sometimes mention accidents on deck during storms, men falling from rigging, ropes mistied, sails ripping apart. None of this is shocking if you picture a sailor running on 2 hours of sleep spread across 3 days. Try tying a secure knot after being awake for 72 hours. Now do it on a swaying mast in the rain. Mistakes happened constantly, and storms punished every mistake with brutal efficiency. There is even one account from the 15th century of a crew that literally missed a signal from their captain because they were asleep in a heap below deck. By the time they stumbled up, half the sails were torn. The captain called them drunkards, but realistically, they were probably just unconscious from sheer exhaustion. Drunkenness and sleep deprivation look surprisingly similar when you're trying to function in a storm. Now, let's not forget the second sleep phenomenon that medieval people often had on land. Many households, especially in Northern Europe, followed a pattern of first sleep in the early evening, then waking up around midnight for prayers, chores, or other activities, before returning to bed for a second sleep until dawn. Sounds quaint, right? On ships, this was impossible. Watches broke the night into strict rotations, and storms blew any chance of pattern out of the water. Sailors might have longed for that peaceful midnight wake-up with a candle and quiet prayer. Instead, they got drenched with seawater and shouted at by the bosun. Another charming difference. On land, wealthier folks had servants warm their beds with heated bricks or iron pans filled with embers. Sailors, meanwhile, just had the warmth of their own damp socks. Fire on ships was restricted to cooking, and even that was risky, which meant no glowing coals to keep you cozy. If you were cold, you either huddled with your shipmates or accepted your fate as a shivering plank burrito. Ship design, to be fair, did try slowly to improve things. By the later Middle Ages, some larger vessels had enclosed forecastles and stern castles, giving more sheltered spots for off-duty crew. But sheltered just meant less wind directly in your face. It didn't mean comfortable. And in storms, water leaked in anyway. Imagine trying to sleep in what amounts to a damp shed nailed onto a floating log. Better than open deck, but only just. One small mercy. Sailors often had cloaks. Heavy wool, oily with years of use, but thick enough to offer some protection from spray and wind. These cloaks doubled as blankets, bedding, even makeshift tents when stretched over ropes. Archaeological finds suggest sailors cherished these garments because they were the closest thing to a comfort item at sea. Forget teddy bears. Your ratty old cloak was the thing you clung to when the waves were roaring and you desperately wanted sleep. The health effects of this constant deprivation carried ashore too. Sailors often staggered off ships half delirious, looking like they'd just survived a battlefield. And in a sense, they had. Towns near ports recorded sailors collapsing in inns, sleeping for days. Others went straight from ship to church, convinced that surviving storms and exhaustion meant divine intervention. One wonders if some of those long prayer sessions were just men snoring on pews. Let's also circle back to the noble passengers, because it's too good not to contrast again. Wealthy travelers sometimes brought elaborate bedding on ship's cushions, canopies, feather mattresses, all carefully packed. When storms hit, sailors might be rolling in puddles while the noble passenger tried, and usually failed, to keep their bed dry. The sight must have been comical. A merchant or knight clutching at soggy silks while his servants bailed water with buckets, right next to barefoot sailors swearing loudly as they tied ropes. If anything proves that wealth doesn't always buy comfort, it's that scene. But here's the important thing. Despite all this misery, sailors did sleep. Not well, not long, not peacefully, but they got just enough to keep moving. The human body adapts, even to the worst conditions. Medieval sailors developed that strange half-conscious rest state, where you're technically asleep but also aware of the next shout or crash. It wasn't restorative, but it was survival. And that's what makes the contrast with land so striking. While nobles worried about thread counts and warmed sheets, sailors learned to pass out on damp wood with rats as bedfellows. It's not a glamorous image, but it's the reality of how Europe's trade, wars, and pilgrimages actually moved across the seas. All the luxury on land depended, in part, on men sleeping badly at sea. So, by now, you can imagine the misery of trying to sleep on a medieval ship in a storm. Wet planks, yelling rats, the occasional boot in your ribs. But sailors weren't just practical people, they were deeply superstitious. And storms at night, when nobody could get proper rest, brought out all sorts of strange beliefs. For example, many sailors believed that sleeplessness itself was a bad omen. If too many men couldn't settle into even a short nap, it meant the sea was unsettled, almost angry, which, given the circumstances, wasn't wrong. But it also meant that every creak and groan of the timbers at night got interpreted as a sign. A loud crack might be the ship straining, or, in their minds, a spirit warning them. Try falling asleep when your exhausted bunkmate whispers that he heard a ghost in the mast. Night storms especially fed the imagination. Lightning and waves in the pitch dark turned into visions of demons, sea monsters, or saints appearing in flashes. Medieval chroniclers mentioned sailors swearing they saw angels hovering above the sails or devils perched on the rigging. Today we'd chalk that up to exhaustion, dehydration, and maybe a bit of bad ale. But at the time, it was taken seriously. A restless, sleepless night wasn't just miserable, it was also spiritual. And then there were the little rituals. Some men swore by tying knots in ropes near where they slept, as charms to keep nightmares away. Others muttered prayers before lying down, hoping for even a brief, dreamless rest. A few carried tiny relics, bones, scraps of cloth tucked into their clothing, as if a saint's shinbone might keep the rats off their toes. Did it work? Probably not. But when you're cold, wet and desperate, a ritual feels better than nothing. Of course, there was also alcohol. Sailors drank constantly, because water went bad fast. On stormy nights, many downed extra ale or watered wine, hoping to pass out despite the noise and chaos. It didn't really work. Alcohol sleep is famously shallow, but at least it made them care less about the rats. In fact, one of the more sarcastic medieval observers noted that sailors snored like thunder themselves, but they could not hear the storms. In other words, the drink drowned out the problem. Now let's pause for a small but important invention, the hammock. Not medieval, technically. Hammocks were introduced to Europeans in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, borrowed from indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, but they became such a perfect solution for sleeping at sea that it was hard not to look back and wonder how medieval sailors managed without them. Hammocks kept you off the damp floor, away from rats, and most importantly cradled your body so you didn't roll around in storms. For the first time in centuries, sailors could actually get a few hours of halfway decent rest. But in the medieval period, they didn't have that luxury. They had to wedge themselves between cargo or tie themselves down with ropes. And when the storm hit, the best you could hope for was to stay put and not get flung across the deck. The hammock was still a dream of the future, one that medieval sailors would have killed for if they'd known about it. Now, if we zoom out for a moment, we see a fascinating irony. On land, sleep was tied to ideas of morality and discipline. Priests warned against sleeping too much. Nobles bragged about their fine beds. Peasants followed the rhythm of the seasons. But at sea, sleep was stripped down to its bare minimum. Survival rest. No philosophy, no luxury, no the beds, just raw exhaustion forcing your body to shut down. And yet, all the grand castles and courts on land depended on these half-sleepless men. The silk in a duchess's gown, carried by sailors who had been awake for 3 nights straight. The spices in a royal feast, hauled across stormy seas by men snoring in puddles. The relics brought back from pilgrimages, guarded by sailors clutching their damp cloaks like blankets. All of it, every ounce of luxury on land, floated on the backs of men who couldn't get a decent night's sleep. So, the next time you sink into your mattress and complain about a noisy neighbor, just imagine the medieval sailor. He's curled up on a plank, cloak pulled tight, storm raging, rats scurrying, and a bosun yelling for him to wake up in 10 minutes anyway. And somehow, he'll manage to sleep just enough to do it all again tomorrow. So here we are, at the end of our long night at sea. We've followed medieval sailors through the storm. We've watched them wedge themselves into corners, pray to saints, curse the waves, and snore through the chaos. We've seen them soak their cloaks, share space with rats, and steal 10-minute naps before another shift. And somehow, this was normal. Not ideal, not pleasant, just the way it was. If you're lying in bed right now, tucked under a blanket, it's worth remembering that most people in history never had that luxury. Medieval peasants often slept on straw pallets. Nobles tossed on lumpy feather beds, and sailors had planks and dampness. Comfort wasn't really the point. Survival was, and if you could wake up after a stormy night with all your fingers, toes, and teeth still in place, you counted yourself lucky. But there's something strangely peaceful about that picture. The sea roaring outside, the timbers creaking, men curled up wherever they could find space, bodies swaying with the waves, half dreaming about dry land. It's not restful by modern standards, but it was its own kind of rhythm. Short bursts of sleep, constant waking, the mind drifting in and out of awareness, like the tide itself. And maybe that's why talking about it now has that drowsy effect. There's no grand battle, no heroic adventure, just tired men trying to catch a little sleep, night after night, year after year. Their world was smaller, simpler, harsher, but in some ways it mirrors ours. Everyone from medieval sailor to modern listener has known the frustration of trying to sleep when the noise outside won't stop. The difference is, you probably won't be rolled across the floor by a barrel of salted herring tonight. At least, I hope not. So as you lie there, imagine the slow rocking of the ship, the faint sound of waves against wood, the murmurs of voices drifting off one by one, a snore here, a cough there, the shuffle of boots above deck, and through it all, the rhythm of the sea, lulling you toward sleep, whether you like it or not. That's where we'll leave the sailors for now. Still tired, still damp, still dreaming of dry land. And we'll leave you here too, with the quiet comfort that at least your bed is better than theirs. Good night, and safe sailing into your dreams.